Hello everyone, welcome to Talk It Out with me, Li Jingjing. This show aims to show you the different voices and stories that are often being neglected by mainstream media. And today I'm very honored to introduce the special guest joining the discussion on current affairs with me, Colonel Richard Black. Colonel Richard Black was the former chief at the Army Criminal Law Division at the Pentagon, a member of the Virginia House of Delegates, and later Virginia Senate. He served for 31 years in the U.S. Marine and the U.S. JAG Corp. I will let Colonel Richard Black to tell us more about his background and his experience in the military. And now, Colonel Richard Black, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. I'll just add to my introduction. I like to make it very clear to people when I'm doing these interviews that, I'm very much an American patriot. I fought in Vietnam. I risked my life literally hundreds of times. I started off, I was a helicopter pilot, flew 269 combat missions. So I joined the 1st Marine Division. I fought 70, often very bloody, combat patrols. I was wounded, and my 2 radio men were killed right beside me, literally within arm's reach in one case. And so then I had a split career where the first half was spent in the United States Marine Corps. And then the second half, I was an Army judge advocate officer, which is a lawyer. We have an organization within the military that enforces the law, that prosecutes crimes, that handles litigation and things like that. And I was very senior in the ranks, had a very successful career as an Army lawyer. And I ended up in the Pentagon, where I was the head of the Criminal Law Division. And I advised the Senate Armed Services Committee on matters of national importance. And I testified before Congress on a number of occasions and prepared executive orders for signature of the President of the United States. So I am very dedicated to the people who serve in the armed forces of the United States, but I have rather grave misgivings about some of our foreign policy. I think starting back, particularly in the time of George Bush, President George Bush, I think we began to take a rather radical direction, and we became overly involved in military action. And I have not supported many of those actions, and some of them I'm very, very strongly opposed to, such as the war in Ukraine, and such as the war to overthrow the government of Syria. And in Syria, for example, where we have sponsored Al-Qaeda, and we have given unwavering support to the Al-Qaeda terrorist movement against the legitimate elected government of Syria. And we have done that since the very beginning of the war, when we sent CIA agents to coordinate with the terrorists and try to overthrow the government of Syria. So I know President Bashar al-Assad and his wife Asma al-Assad. I know them personally. I have met with them on a couple of occasions. Not with Asma. I've only met with her once, but I met with the president twice, and I met with the president of Lebanon on a couple of occasions, and with virtually almost the entire legislative body in Syria. I have photos with all of them and this kind of thing. So So very, very strenuously opposed to what we're doing in Syria, likewise in Ukraine. And I think that some of the direction that we are taking relative to China is unnecessarily provocative. And I think the unfortunate thing is that while there may be some very wealthy globalists around the world who benefit enormously from hostilities and conflict, neither the Chinese nor the American people gain anything from this escalation of tensions between the countries. So anyway, that's a little bit of my background, and I appreciate you having me on today.
First, I want to discuss with you the situation in Afghanistan because it has been exactly 1 year since the United States withdrew its troops in Afghanistan. But the humanitarian crisis in this country is severe on many levels. For example, millions of Afghans are facing acute food insecurities. So I'm wondering, how do you make the 20 years of U.S. involvement in this country since 2001 in the aftermath of 9/11? And how do you make the U.S. foreign policies towards Afghanistan?
The policy of going into Afghanistan was disastrous. We went in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, and we know that there were al-Qaeda forces that were training in remote parts of Afghanistan. It was certainly legitimate to attack those camps. I supported the attack on those camps right after 9/11. But what we did not need to do was to occupy the country. We went in there with very little sense of direction about what our purpose was. And it's really very revealing that the Secretary of Defense at that time, Donald Rumsfeld, sent notes to his people sometime after we had put a very large military force on the ground in Afghanistan. And he inquired, he said, just who are we fighting? He didn't know who the enemy was in Afghanistan. He knew that we had all of these troops there, but even the Secretary of Defense did not understand the mission in Afghanistan. So we were there for 20 years, and during the entire 20 years, this has always been a puppet government. The collapse of the Afghan government was inevitable, and very few people think about this, but had the Afghan army fought with great courage and so forth, there would have been an enormous amount of bloodshed in Afghanistan after we left. The soldiers would have been killed on our side. The Taliban would have been killed on the other side. And no doubt in the aftermath of that type of war, there would have been enormous retribution against civilians who fought on one side or the other. So to my mind, looking at it in a very dispassionate way, I think it was a tremendous blessing that the government folded immediately. The army collapsed almost immediately, and as a result of that, we avoided enormous. I say we, the world, avoided enormous bloodshed and suffering in Afghanistan that would have taken place had the army actually put up a stiff defense. So I think if we look at it with pure logic, we'll arrive at that understanding that the best thing in the world, if they were going to lose anyway, was to lose quickly, to lose with very little bloodshed. So the government and the army were always a mere facade they weren't really legitimate in any sense of the word. The government folded the instant that we stopped propping it up. But it's important to remember that Afghanistan historically is the graveyard of nations. The British went in, and their armies were almost slaughtered to a man as they withdrew. The Soviet Union went in, and after very bitter fighting, they were forced to withdraw. And then the United States went in, and I think we can sort of thank our lucky stars that we didn't suffer more grievously than what we did. And we got out in relatively good shape, except for the fact that this, along with all of these other wars that we've been fighting, are simply devouring our financial strength. And it's also hurting us in terms of our foreign relations. But I think it is a very good thing that we are out of Afghanistan. There was a special report, an investigative report that analyzed the reasons for the collapse of Afghanistan, and the report said, well, we didn't train them right. We withdrew our contractors too rapidly. But if we had stayed 50 years instead of 20, the government still would have been illegitimate. And the moment that we left, it still would have collapsed. And the only difference is that we would have padded the Swiss bank accounts of all of these arms dealers and crooked politicians more so than we did in 20 years.
But another thing is the Biden administration freezes the $7 billion assets of Afghanistan. And I think many countries are demanding that these assets needs to be returned to Afghanistan, especially when the people are suffering from earthquake, natural disasters, hunger, the basic needs. And yet I think Biden administration used the excuse that they will use half of the assets to help the victims of the family members of the victim of 9/11. But I think I saw news that even the family members of the victims said this is illegitimate, immoral for us to use this money. So they don't want to use the money. To me, this is immoral and absurd on many levels, that you are freezing the assets that belongs to a country and actually they need the money the most right now. So they are punishing the Afghan people collectively for 9/11. Like, none of the hijackers are actually from Afghanistan, but right now the normal civilians, the normal Afghans are suffering from these punishments. What's your thoughts?
Well, I'm very familiar with the victims of 9/11. I've been in touch with the leaders from there. They've actually been supporters of mine when I was in political office. Wonderful people. Their focus has always been on Saudi Arabia, which never paid any price for their complicity in the destruction of the Twin Towers. The idea that 13 people who don't even speak English, who's never been in the country, could come over here and hijack jet airliners and fly them into the Twin Towers. It is so absurd. There is no way that it could have happened without the Saudi government involvement. And in my view, and this is speculative, and I'll admit it, but I believe that there is no possibility that Saudi Arabia would have acted without approval from the highest levels of the American government. And so I have this uneasy feeling that the 9/11 attacks may have been carried out in coordination with some very high-level American officials. So to get back to the basics of this, the beef that the 9/11 people is not with Afghanistan. It is with Saudi Arabia. And it's very convenient for the government, for the U.S. government to say, oh, well, here, we'll give you this money. You take money from these people. And this is not money that belongs to the Taliban. It's not money that belongs to the previous government. It's money that belongs to the people of Afghanistan. Now, some have said it's $7 billion. Originally, they were saying $9 billion. I suspect $9 billion is more accurate. But it's a very, very difficult political situation. Even if the Biden administration wants to return that money to Afghanistan, the Republicans will immediately attack them savagely. They won't say, well, you're giving this back to the Afghan people that soldiers died ostensibly fighting for all these years. No, they'll say, you're giving it to the Taliban that we fought against. It's very, very difficult for the Biden administration to do this. If it were Trump, if it were President Trump in office today, he would find it very difficult to overcome the political problem. It's sort of a political dilemma for whichever party tries to release the funds. I wish it could be done. I hope that someone finds a way to do it. It is important for us to realize that whether it's $7 billion or $9 billion, that's not going to support Afghanistan for very long. The United States and other countries were pouring vast sums of money into Afghanistan before we withdrew, enormous sums that dwarf the $7 or $9 billion. But I think you're correct. It's money that belongs to the people. We should release it to the people. I hope someone finds a way, but I think it's important as realists to understand that the political dilemma of releasing is very, very difficult.
Let's move on to Taiwan region, because the relations between the United States and China has been escalated dramatically after Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan region. And just in the past few weeks, several senators from the United States also visited Taiwan, despite China's officials from different departments made it very clear that this is the ultimate red line that no one should cross, either verbally or militarily. And because I think not many people in the West or the general public in the West probably don't know that one of the foundations to the diplomatic relations between China and the United States is actually the United States recognize the one China policy, and Taiwan is part of China, and the U.S. will only remain unofficial relations with the Taiwan region. But so because of these recent moves from the several U.S. officials, China sees these moves as the U.S. violates the agreements between the two countries. But the United States sees this is not a violation of the one China policy, and the U.S. officials can do whatever they want, and they can go to any part of the world they want. So what's your view on this situation? Do you think the United States is provoking a war with China in this region?
Let me just begin by saying that I strongly believed that that the one China policy that was established by President Richard Nixon back in 1971, I think that's when it all started, I thought it was one of the great diplomatic achievements of American history, going all the way back to the very beginning of the country. Henry Kissinger has recently spoken about the tension in the relations between the United States and China that have developed over the last several years, just perhaps 5 years or so. And his now, I think he's 99 years old now, Henry Kissinger is. He was one of the architects of the one China policy. The one China policy recognized the reality of the situation, that Beijing was the by far the dominant force in China, and we recognized that Beijing was the capital of China, and that it was the capital of a single unitary China that included Taiwan. At the same time, there were enormous political pressures within the United States to protect Taiwan. And so we developed a rather subtle policy. The Chinese understood it clearly, and we did. And the policy was that we would recognize the government in Beijing as the single government of China, but we would also recognize that Taiwan had a certain level of autonomy. And in order to succeed as it did, it had to be handled with some delicacy on both sides. Henry Kissinger has pointed out that this one China policy, which recognized political realities in China and political realities in the United States, has avoided war and promoted trade and prosperity in both nations for the last 50 years. It's been enormously successful. It literally has changed the entire world. It has lifted the entire world economy. It has stabilized affairs within Asia. It has kept Asia very, very stable. And so Kissinger pointed out, he said we're embarked on sort of an aimless policy, kind of an emotional policy that there's no intellectual underpinning for what we are doing. And we don't know where we're headed. We don't know what our objective is. It's just sort of a series of actions. Now, if you look specifically at what Nancy Pelosi did, Nancy Pelosi went to China with the specific purpose of escalating tensions. She didn't have any business that had to be carried out in Taiwan. She went there for the sole purpose of sticking a sharp eye in China's face. And it's interesting, and very few people connect this, but she also went to Kiev in Ukraine, and she met with Zelensky. So she's putting a stick in the eye of the Russian people, a stick in the eye of the Chinese people. Now, Nancy Pelosi will probably not be in Congress. This is my view, but the Democrats are almost certain to lose control of the House of Representatives in November this year. And when they do, it's very difficult to imagine that Nancy Pelosi is going to take her seat among all of the ordinary congressmen. I think she will retire at that point. And she is probably thinking ahead of what she will do and what her sources of income and influence will be. And she seems to have been banking on doing things that will escalate tensions, escalate conflict. And I've never seen that she has any concern for the American people, the Chinese people, the Russian people, any people. Her concern is with herself, and so this type of thing has been terribly destructive to world peace and to the interest of both nations. It started under the administration of President Trump, but President Trump he liked the Chinese people. He had good relations with President Xi Jinping. He wanted a better deal in trade with China. And so he imposed tariffs. He did things to give him some leverage in negotiating better trade deals. But it really wasn't his intention to create animosity between Americans and Chinese. He's at a personal level. If you go beyond the Twitters, he actually is a very decent and thoughtful person. You might not get that from because when he's fighting with powerful people, he is not afraid to use force. But when he deals with the most humble of people, he deals with them with great kindness and humility himself. So he's not the kind of person who likes war. He doesn't like conflict, but he wants a good business deal. He's a good businessman, just as many of the Chinese are. They're good businessmen too. So we've gone off on this very destructive policy. And if you look at what is going on with both Russia and with China, we have people willing to take the most incredibly reckless steps because we always have to realize we're dealing with nuclear powers, particularly the things we have done in the Ukraine against Russia. The level of recklessness has just almost bordered on insanity. We have American intelligence agencies targeting the assassination of Russian generals, where we've admitted that we helped to assassinate 13 Russian generals. We helped to sink the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. It wouldn't have been sunk without American intelligence and assistance. These are actions that are wildly, insanely reckless. We're talking about the two greatest nuclear superpowers in the world, the U.S. and Russia. And these deep state actors, the warmongers in Congress, in Davos, Switzerland, all of these globalists, they are relying on President Putin to be absolutely emotionless, to be totally rational, so that we can be as reckless as possible. But he is the one that we rely on to prevent an escalation into nuclear war. It's really quite bizarre because you see the American media, at least at the beginning of this war, they were talking about him as being a madman, that he was losing his mind. I mean, just insane propaganda. And yet, here we are relying on his total rationality, his total lack of being swept up by emotions, and we're risking the lives of more than half the people on the planet by relying on his rationality. And to some extent, we're doing likewise with China. We're saying, well, look, we can go over there. We can do these recklessly provocative acts. We can fly Nancy Pelosi over and sort of dare the Chinese to take some military action that will provoke a war. Well, we're relying on China not doing something irrational. So we're doing irrational things, but we're saying we're confident that the Chinese will not be irrational, or the Russians. That is a recipe for the extermination of mankind, because you can never count on any single person to be totally rational, to not suddenly have an outburst of anger or that sort of thing. Now, I think fortunately, and I won't get into Chinese politics, but I will speak to the Russian situation, because they're not involved in elections. But I think there are a few world leaders who are more rational than President Putin. He's extraordinarily intellectual, very bright, and he is very self-disciplined. And there have been many times that I'm sure there were people in Russia who said, come on, let's get the people angered. Let's get them fired up. Let's do this or that. And he always takes a very calm, deliberate approach to things. And we can all thank God that he does, because had he done things as recklessly as we have done, we might see, a nuclear holocaust engulfing the war by now, or the world by now.
I'm very surprised what you just said, and I'm sure some media in the West are gonna label you as a Russia sympathizer or Russian propagandist for what you just said. But even though you came to this conclusion by your analysis, by your reading into the Russian politics or the world politics.
Let me say this. I was almost killed a number of times by weapons supplied by the Soviet Union to North Vietnam. And I can just remember one time I was controlling an airstrike, and I ran up into an observation tower so that I had a better view of the battlefield. And when I did, there was a sniper on a hill about half a mile away. And he was a very, very good sniper. He was a wonderfully good shot. And he fired 2 rounds, and there was a tin roof over my head. There were sandbags that covered from my waist on down. And this was up on a wooden platform. And he fired the first round, and it hit the corrugated steel, and it pierced it about 3 inches above my head, directly on center. And then he fired the second round, and it hit near the top of the sandbags, almost right exactly in my belly. Now, those bullets were made in the Soviet Union. They may have been made in in Russia, or they may have been made in Ukraine, which was part of the Soviet Union back then.
Mm-hmm.
But in any event, they were made under the direction of the Soviet government, and had the person making those bullets added 1 grain of powder to the cartridge or 1 less grain, one of those 2 bullets, it would have either gone a little higher or a little lower. I would not be speaking to you today. So, but that was the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union, the Federation of Russia bears little resemblance to the Soviet Union, which I fought against. I was actually part of the NATO forces when I was stationed in West Germany. And I was prepared to fight if Germany were attacked. But I'm a realist, and I recognize that in the ashes of the old Soviet Union arose a new country, which was the Russian Federation, that had no interest whatsoever in threatening Europe or threatening the United States. The Warsaw Pact, which was the counterpart for NATO, simply dissolved and went away. Everybody just left. They went home. One of the great tragedies of American history is that NATO was not dissolved. And NATO could not exist. It had this enormous bureaucracy of very highly paid people, all of these military think tanks, and it was important to create the illusion that the new Russian Federation was just a generic substitute for the old Soviet Union. They were both the same types of countries, and yet they were radically different. They were dramatically different, and most importantly, they represented no external threat whatsoever. And so it's unfortunate. Very few people, I'm sure it's the same in China, Russia, India, wherever. Ordinary people don't understand foreign affairs. Often we're talking about countries, and most people couldn't find Taiwan on the map. They couldn't find Ukraine on the map. It's sort of an intellectual elite that understands matters of foreign policy. And so it makes it very easy for propaganda to move and to shift public opinion. So that's kind of where we are today. But I did want to interject this. I say this as someone who's very much wants American people to have the best in this world, and at the same time, I want to see people in China and in Russia and in Ukraine do better.
I think in last video I did also with the Taiwan compatriot and also a former U.S. Marine, we discussed the geopolitical interests for the United States to create chaos in the Asia-Pacific region. And I remember the Taiwan compatriot Xiang Yu said, the United States sees Taiwan as nothing but a natural aircraft carrier that cannot be sunk. They don't care about the people of the Taiwan. It's just a geopolitical, it's a perfect place to fulfill the United States geopolitical interest to contain China and also the Asia-Pacific region. So do you agree with his assessment of seeing Taiwan as a natural aircraft carrier that can be sunk?
Well, I don't know precisely what he said. I do know that realistically, Taiwan, the island of Taiwan, it's a large and significant island. It has a very, very difficult terrain, which gives it certain inherent defensive capabilities. the English Channel, which separates Great Britain from the mainland of Europe, from France and Germany. It's only 21 miles across, and yet it has protected them from invasion for centuries. The straits between China and Taiwan are 150 miles of open ocean. So it's a tremendous barrier, military barrier. The Chinese military certainly understands the challenges of a military invasion, and I think if the United States were not constantly provoking, and we really, the U.S. forces China to react. It's not that China says, well, let's plot and plan and let's do an invasion. It's that when the United States does some provocative thing, like Nancy Pelosi's visit, then it compels China out of patriotism, out of their basic vital interest, to take some sort of reaction and response. I think Nancy Pelosi was probably hoping that China would take more aggressive actions than they did. But I think China has acted in a way to diffuse tensions rather than escalate tensions. I've never seen any serious indication that China's intent was to simply invade Taiwan. I think they hope over time to gradually persuade and certainly to put pressure on Taiwan to reunite with the mainland. But they're very patient, and I think it's really somewhat of a creation of certain elements within the United States, within Western countries, to try to keep these tensions going. You look at one of the successes that Nancy Pelosi has had. Now Taiwan is buying a lot of American weapons. They're buying Harpoon missiles. They're buying anti-aircraft missiles. She did that. She did that on her own. She managed to bring about a tremendous transfer of wealth from the Taiwanese people to the American people. And so the things, it's not as though there are issues of right and wrong or justice that are propelling this. It's a matter of cash. It's money. It's power, and that's very sad, because the cash, the money, the power doesn't go to the American people. It goes to a handful of influential politicians and the globalists who coordinate with them to decide what policies the world will take. And those policies are not good for the Chinese people. They're not good for the American people. They're not good for the European people. They are harmful to all of humanity. These globalist schemes that attempt to dictate the future of mankind are extremely destructive to individual families across the globe. And so I think it's a very bad direction, and that's, I'm very opposed to it. Even if we gain wealth from selling these weapons, it's certainly not worth the risk we're taking.
In one of your earliest speeches, you mentioned the illusion of Chinese and Russian aggressions was created by the deep state and the military-industrial complex because they need an enemy. And so can you talk more on that? Because we've seen some Western governments and Western media are depicting China as this evil force that will soon take over the world, even though China wasn't in any war for at least in the past 40 years. So where does this narrative come from? How do you see this narrative on China?
It is a strange thing. The Chinese government has five military bases outside of the country. The United States and the United Kingdom have 875. I may be a little bit off on those numbers, but I'm not off by much. 5 versus 875. So China has very little military force outside of its borders, extremely little. I mean, it's almost negligible. If you look at the military history of China in recent years, the conflicts they've had have been border conflicts, and the border conflicts, sometimes they've been sharp conflicts, but they've been limited. It hasn't been a situation where China decided to send vast armies to conquer Vietnam. No. Right after, I think it was right after the United States left Vietnam, there was a very sharp border war over the exact boundaries between China and the very northern part of Vietnam. But it wasn't intended to acquire new territory. It was intended to maintain the territory that China had. A similar situation exists with India, where there have always been some tensions about the exact lines between China and India. But both countries have handled it with a great deal of maturity and good judgment. Even, the Chinese fought a war with Russia. Again, it was over the boundary line, and it was a sharp war. It was some years back, but it wasn't designed where the Chinese were trying to attack and seize some great area within Russia. It was to define the border. And so you compare that with nations that go to the other side of the globe and conduct wars there. It's a totally different situation. And so I think that these wars that are fought far from a nation's own borders they're not helpful to world peace. They're not helpful to world trade. And I think in the case of the United States, I think they're very counterproductive. They hurt the American people, and there are some very powerful mega billionaires who profit greatly from these things, but the people don't profit. So I think. Yes, there is certainly an illusion that is created by militarists who very much want to provoke a continuing state of tension, which I don't believe is necessary.
So you don't think China is aggressor, even though many Western politicians, even when they try to win for election, for say Australia, and it's strange to me because for any officials from the United Kingdom, from Australia, when they try to get elected, they always talk about China, how China will be a threat, how we're gonna be tough on China. I mean, for me, it's like if you want to win as a leader of your country, you try to make offers, give better deals, how to solve your domestic problems. But right now, I think China is the perfect enemy in the eyes of many politicians in Western countries, which is bizarre to me. So how come China is the aggressor to these Western countries?
Well, it is a sad thing. The Chinese have an ancient history that predates most civilizations around the world, and they have great patience. And but if you set aside that one, I wonder how many politicians could say, "Well, where are the Chinese threatening military force anywhere?" I would have difficulty if I were trying to write propaganda for the other side, for other people who believe in a more aggressive policy. I'd have difficulty thinking of anything I could come up with. China has always been focused on its internal issues. It's had great challenges and it's had great successes. And I think if they had their way, now certainly they have the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative has been extremely successful, but it doesn't hurt anyone. China invests money where they think they can get a good return on it. They don't try to interfere in the domestic politics of the countries that they go into, and they don't assassinate people. They don't overthrow governments. What does that hurt? It promotes trade, and trade is usually a very good thing. So it's a strange world that we live in. I think I know President Trump certainly intended to lower the level of tensions, very much like President Nixon. President Nixon was elected on a promise to end the war in Vietnam, to lower tensions around the world, and he did a great deal under enormous pressure. There were deep state actors who managed to overthrow President Nixon and to force him from office. And we saw the very similar type of activity with President Trump, where you had the FBI, which was militarized basically to force the president from office. That was at the very highest levels of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Their top objective was to undermine the presidency of President Donald Trump in order to continue the global tensions and military activity around the world. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has become a very poisonous and corrupted institution within the United States. Many Americans are becoming more and more aware of just how corrosive and damaging they are to the nation. They assisted in this raid on President Trump's residence at Mar-a-Lago in Florida, and obviously a concocted, unwarranted raid. And I say that as someone who was the chief of the criminal law division for the Army, who was responsible for justice across the globe for 750,000 people, and the idea that somehow the Federal Bureau of Investigation had to tip off the news media first. They notified all the news media so they would be there, and then they came bursting in with 30 FBI agents armed with semi-automatic, well, not semi-automatic, with automatic, fully automatic submachine guns, 30 agents, as though they expected President Trump to come to the door and throw a rock at them or something, and they would all shoot him down or something. And they came in with all of their lights on and all of them strutting around like an army descending on someone. This is the kind of thing that Americans traditionally used to condemn. That we would give that almost as a reason to go to war with a country, that it was a kind of country that would conduct a raid on a political opponent's home. It's just obscene.
In many of your analysis on the Ukraine crisis, you've criticized the United States' role, you've criticized the NATO's role, and because of the analysis you gave, you've been labeled as a Russian propagandist or information terrorist by the Ukrainian government. But as you mentioned earlier in this interview, you've served for 31 years in the U.S. Marine and U.S. Army. You were wounded and bled for this country. You are a patriotic American. So calling you a Russian propagandist is absurd. But I'm also wondering why someone like you, who worked in a very high position in the US government, decided to come out to say other views that are probably deemed as very unpleasant to the government or probably even to the general public.
My concern is with the people. I guess one of the advantages that I have, I don't want anything. I don't want money. I don't want position. I don't want power. But I care very deeply about the future of my children, my grandchildren, and everyone's children and grandchildren. I think the number one thing, I want to avoid a nuclear war. We've never been closer to nuclear war than we are today. Now, when I say today, probably we were a little bit closer to nuclear war 3 months ago. We were very, very close to nuclear war. Today, a little less so, partly because of interviews like we're conducting right now. It's starting to diffuse some of the war energy on the deep state side. But so my interest is in the people. First, the American people. I want to see the American people do better. But at the same time, there was an incident when I was fighting in Vietnam. One night we went out on patrol, and we circled around behind a hamlet. There was a platoon of Viet Cong soldiers who had entered the village and raised the flag because it was sort of a symbol. We're coming after you, because we were up on this ridge line and they were beginning to gather on all sides. And so I went around in the dark of night with this blocking force, and then in the very early morning hours, another platoon was to attack and drive them into our guns. And so I'm sitting in the darkness, peering and straining to see what's out there. And all of a sudden, a figure came through the darkness. And I peered and I looked, and it was an old woman, an ancient woman, and she was hobbling out. And she was going to the bathroom out in the jungle. And I looked at my radium-dialed wristwatch to see, and H hour, the hour of the attack, was in 5 minutes. And so I thought to myself, this isn't going to happen. I knew the woman would die. She was in this firing zone where all of the guns crisscrossed, and nothing out there would live once the guns opened up. And so I told my radio man, I said, pass the line down, pass the word down the line that not to shoot. I'm going in. And then I passed the word down the other way. And so I got up and I began to very quickly walk towards the woman who was probably 50 yards away. And my radio man, Corporal Smith, he joined me. He got up and we went out. When we got to the woman, it was pitch black. And of course, she's terrified. And so she hitched up her pants and she tried to begin hobbling away. We had no time to argue with her, and she was very frail. So I lifted her with my right arm and Smitty with his left arm. And we began quickly walking back to our lines. And as we did, a sentry spotted us and he fired a rifle grenade. And those grenades go up and then down. So it takes a few moments before it hits and explodes. And as soon as we heard it go off, we ran and we just plunged through the jungle. And we got to the edge of the rice paddy, which was all covered with water and mud. And we leaped through the air with the old lady flying like a rag doll through the air. And we hit face down in the mud and the water. And the grenade exploded about 3 feet from us, but we were down, and it hit up on the rice paddy dike. So neither of us were hurt. The lady wasn't hurt. And then at that moment, that triggered the attack, and the valley echoed with gunfire then for the next 20 minutes, and until the platoon, the Viet Cong platoon, was annihilated. Now, what was it that caused me to take a tremendous risk of my own life for a woman whose life expectancy might have been 2 years? She was an old lady. She had no money. She was in poverty. When she went to the bathroom, she went out in the bushes. She lived in a thatched hut. But to me, justice is a very important thing. I have a very keen sense of justice, and I don't like to see innocent people hurt. I will tell you, I controlled the dropping of bombs. I probably dropped perhaps more bombs than any Marine during the Vietnam War. Now, when I say drop them, I ordered them to be dropped. And I'm sure there were many innocent people who got caught in all of that. So I was not an unduly soft-hearted person. I was a very strong Marine. But when it came down to the deliberate taking of an innocent life, I would do a great deal to avoid it, even if it meant that I might die in the process. Perhaps I have a different psychology. I know that I have a different psychology than many people do, but that's where I'm coming from. And I think many people that know me respect that. And that is why I, to some extent, maybe I'm sort of a fair broker. I see things from both sides and try to be just in dealing with both sides, at the same time protecting the interests of the American people.
As someone who actually been in wars, who has been in battlefields, you know how dangerous weapons are, how dangerous wars are, and how devastating it is to the whole world. So literally, Colonel Richard Black, I take my hats off to you, my full respect to you for what you just said, for all the messages you try to tell to the world. And seeing frank and sincere politicians and soldiers like you gives me hope that this world can be better. Thank you so much, Colonel Richard Black, for your time for this interview. I hope you can come back to my show more often.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.